My name is Lexi Guthrie, 33 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army, and I am currently standing in front of my father's casket in my full dress blues. As the pastor finishes his prayer, Karen, the stepmother who has infested my home for 6 years, leans in close to my ear. She does not offer condolences. Instead, she hisses through her teeth, loud enough for the neighbors in the front row to hear. Stop with the fake tears. Your father told me before he died that you are just a stray he took in. He never loved you. The entire estate, the house, and Guthrie Construction belonged to Charles, my son. That is the only bloodline he recognized. She looks at me with triumph, expecting me to collapse or scream like a lunatic so she can play the victim. But she doesn't know that inside my left breast pocket, right beneath my medals, sits a USB drive and a DNA test result that my father's lawyer handed to me this very morning. Let me know where you are listening from and hit that subscribe button if you believe that a soldier might get ambushed. But she never surrenders to traitors within her own family. The scent of lilies in St. Mark's Chapel was thick enough to choke a person. It was that cloying, heavy sweetness that tries too hard to mask the smell of death, but only ends up making it more obvious. I stood at the position of attention, my spine locked straight against the back of the pew, encased in the rigid wool of my army dress blues. My white gloves were clenched so tight around the brim of my cover that I could feel the seams biting into my skin. My eyes were fixed forward, locked onto the mahogany casket draped in the American flag where my father, Thomas Guthrie, lay resting. It should have been a moment of silence, a moment of honor. But there was no peace here. Not with Karen sitting 3 feet away. She was in the front row, putting on the performance of a lifetime. She dabbed at dry eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, letting out calculated sobs at perfect intervals. But I knew those tears weren't for Dad. They were for the audience. They were for the neighbors, the church ladies, and the business partners filling the pews behind us. Next to her sat Charles, her 22-year-old son, my stepbrother. He was slumped in the pew, wearing a black suit that looked far too expensive, a suit I knew for a fact was bought with a swipe of my father's credit card while Dad was in the ICU. But that wasn't what made my blood boil. It was the flag. The ceremonial folded flag, the triangle of blue and stars that represents a life of service, was sitting on his lap. He was holding it casually, carelessly, like it was a throw pillow or a piece of junk mail he hadn't bothered to toss yet. Under the shelter of his suit jacket, I saw the blue glow of a smartphone screen reflecting on his face. He was scrolling through social media during the eulogy, occasionally covering a yawn with the back of his hand. He looked bored. He looked like this was a detention hall he couldn't wait to leave, not the funeral of the man who had paid for his college, his car, and his lifestyle for the last 6 years. The pastor finally nodded, signaling the start of the final viewing. It was time. My body moved on instinct. I took a step forward toward the aisle, intending to be the first to salute my father. But a hand shot out, blocking my path. It pressed firmly against the medals on my chest. It was Karen. She looked up at me, her face blotchy from the fake crying, but her eyes were dry and sharp as razor blades. "Charles goes first," she said. Her voice wasn't a whisper. She pitched it just loud enough to carry to the first 2 rows of mourners. "He is the son. He is the new man of the house. The order must be respected, Lexi." I froze. The audacity hit me like a physical blow. Charles didn't even look at me. He just smirked, a little twitch at the corner of his mouth, and stood up. He adjusted that expensive silk tie, pushed past me, and strutted toward the casket. He didn't bow his head. He didn't place a hand on the wood. He just stood there for a brief second, checking his reflection in the polished brass handle of the coffin before moving on. A ripple of whispers went through the chapel. I swallowed the lump of rage forming in my throat. I took a step back. Discipline. Maintain bearing. I would not make a scene in God's house. Then it was my turn. I walked to the casket, my dress shoes clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. I removed my right glove and placed my bare hand on the rough fabric of the stars and stripes covering the wood. The cold from inside the casket seemed to seep through the flag, chilling my fingertips. "I'm home, Dad," I whispered, my voice breaking just a fraction. "I'm finally here." Suddenly, I felt a hot, humid breath on the back of my neck. Karen had followed me up. She was standing right in my personal space, invading the final private moment I had with my father. She leaned in, her lips almost brushing my earlobe. "Stop acting, Lexi," she hissed. The sound was like a viper sliding through dry grass. "Your father told me everything the night he died. He said you are just a stray he took in out of pity. He regretted adopting an ungrateful brat like you." My heart hammered against my ribs. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "He never loved you," she continued, twisting the knife. "Everything, the money, the company, the house, it all goes to Charles. That is the only bloodline he recognized. You get nothing. You are nobody. You are just an outsider." She pulled back abruptly and let out a wailing sob, loud and theatrical, throwing her arms out as she turned to the congregation. "Oh, Lexi," she cried out, her voice trembling with mock sympathy. "I know you are hurting because you aren't his real blood. But please, don't blame your father for his choices." The silence in the chapel was shattered. The murmurs erupted into a buzz of shocked conversation. I could feel the eyes boring into my back. I looked up and saw Mrs. Ruth, the neighbor who used to bake me cookies, looking at me with confusion and pity. I saw Pete, Dad's foreman, frowning deeply. They were buying it. They were believing the grieving widow. In that second, standing alone at the altar, I felt more isolated than I ever had in a combat zone. I looked at Karen, burying her face in her hands, and Charles, who was now openly grinning at me from the side. Panic started to rise in my chest, hot and suffocating. But then, a voice cut through the noise in my head. It was the voice of my drill sergeant from basic training, screaming over the sound of live fire. In an ambush, panic is death. Assess, adapt, overcome. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the air into my lungs. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply nodded, once, slowly. I reached up and tapped my left breast pocket, feeling the hard outline of the USB drive and the crisp edge of the envelope hidden there. I looked Karen dead in the eye. My face was a mask of stone. "Go ahead and laugh, Karen," I thought. "The ambush didn't start today. It started 4 days ago, and you have no idea what's coming for you. To understand the fire burning inside me at the funeral, you have to go back 4 days. You have to understand that the ambush didn't start in the chapel. It started 400 miles away, on a dusty field at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 1, 2, 3, 4. The chant of the new recruits echoed across the training grounds, rhythmic and powerful. The sun was beating down on the back of my neck, sweat soaking through my camouflage uniform. But I felt alive. I was correcting the grip of a young private who was struggling with his rifle, my hands firm and steady. I loved the Army. I loved it because it made sense. In the military, life is binary. You meet the standard, or you don't. You do your job, you get promoted. You mess up, you do push-ups. There is no gray area. There are no lies. But then a vibration in my pocket broke the rhythm. My phone. Strictly speaking, I shouldn't have answered it on the drill pad. But when I pulled it out and saw the name Stepmom Karen flashing on the cracked screen, a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Karen never called. She only texted demands for money or complaints. If she was calling, the world had shifted off its axis. I signaled for a corporal to take over the formation and jogged to the edge of the dirt field, kicking up red dust with my boots. "Hello, Karen? What's wrong?" I asked, my breath hitching slightly from the run. There was a pause on the other end. No background noise, no crying, just a dead, static silence. Then, her voice came through, dry and brittle like dead leaves being crushed underfoot. "He's gone, Lexi. His heart stopped at 9 this morning. The doctor said it was a massive cardiac arrest. It was quick." I froze. My boots were rooted to the North Carolina clay. "What?" The word came out as a whisper. "What do you mean, gone? Dad?" "But he was fine. I just spoke to him last week." "Well, old people die, Lexi," Karen cut in, her tone incredibly bored, as if she were reporting a broken washing machine or a leak in the roof. "It happens." My knees gave out. I didn't decide to kneel. My legs simply refused to hold the weight of my body anymore. I hit the dirt, one hand bracing myself, the other gripping the phone so hard the plastic creaked. No, I gasped, air struggling to enter my lungs. No, that's not right. Where is he? I need to talk to the doctor. I'm coming home. I'll request emergency leave right now. I can catch a flight out of Fayetteville tonight. Don't bother, Karen said instantly. The boredom in her voice was replaced by a sharp, guarding tone. Plane tickets are expensive, Lexi. Last-minute fares are hundreds of dollars. Don't waste the money. Waste the money, I shouted, causing a few recruits 50 yards away to turn their heads. He is my father, Karen. I want to see him. He is dead, Lexi. You seeing him won't change that, she sighed, a long dramatic exhale of annoyance. Just send the money you would have spent on the ticket to me. Funerals are expensive, you know. I have to take care of everything. Charles is in shock, the poor boy. I have to focus on the living. I am coming home, I growled, tears finally spilling over, cutting tracks through the dust on my face. Do what you want, she snapped. But don't expect a welcome party. I'm having him cremated immediately. There won't be a viewing. Click. The dial tone buzzed in my ear. It sounded like a hammer striking a nail, over and over again. Tut! 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 She had hung up on me. She hadn't used the Red Cross message system, which is the proper, dignified way a soldier is supposed to be notified of a death in the family. That would have involved a chaplain, a private room, and respect. No. She had called me directly to control the narrative, to shock me, and to tell me to send cash instead of my presence. I screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound that ripped out of my throat, slamming my phone into the red dirt. Hours later, I was sitting on a Delta Airlines flight, staring out into the pitch-black sky. The cabin was dark, filled with the soft snoring of strangers and the hum of the engines. My forehead rested against the cold plastic of the window, chilling my skin, but it couldn't cool the burning shame in my chest. I unlocked my phone and opened my call log. My thumb hovered over the entry from 3 days ago. Dad, missed call. I remembered that moment vividly. I had been in a briefing. I saw his name pop up. I hit decline and sent a quick text. Busy right now. Call you later. Love you, Dad. I never called later. I got busy. I got tired. I thought I had time. I thought he would always be there, sitting in his recliner, waiting for me to check in. That text message was the last thing I ever said to him. Busy right now. The regret tasted like bile in the back of my throat. Les Brown once said the graveyard is the richest place on earth because it is filled with words that were never said. Now, my father was in that graveyard, and I was up here at 30,000 feet, holding a phone full of silence. If you have ever lost someone and would give anything to go back and answer that one missed call, please hit the like button and comment, "Family first," below. Let's remind each other what truly matters before it's too late. I closed my eyes, letting a single tear slide down my nose. I prayed to a God I wasn't sure was listening. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. But I promise you this, I'm going home now. And I am not going there to mourn quietly. I'm going there to fight for you. By the time the taxi dropped me off at the house the next morning, the sun was just coming up. I stood on the sidewalk, my duffel bag heavy on my shoulder. The house looked the same, yet completely alien. The blinds were drawn tight. But what made my stomach turn was the front porch. The American flag that Dad flew every single day of his life had been taken down. The pole was empty. And right next to the front steps, stabbed into the lawn that Dad used to mow with such pride, was a sign. For sale. I gripped the handle of my bag. My sadness was evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just walking into a house of mourning. I was walking into occupied territory. I dragged my heavy duffel bag up the concrete steps of the front porch, the wheels rumbling like distant thunder. My eyes were still burning from the sight of that "for sale" sign staked into the lawn. Dad hadn't even been buried yet, and they were already liquidating his life. It felt less like a real estate transaction and more like a vulture picking a carcass clean. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Immediately, I was assaulted. For 30 years, this house had smelled of cedar wood, sawdust, and the faint, comforting scent of Old Spice. That was the smell of Thomas Guthrie. But today, that scent was gone. In its place was a suffocating cloud of stale cigarette smoke and cheap floral department store perfume. It was the smell of Karen. I stepped into the living room and stopped dead. The space was unrecognizable. Furniture had been rearranged, shoved against walls to make room for boxes. But what made my stomach turn was Dad's chair. It was an old leather lazy-boy recliner, worn smooth in the spots where his elbows had rested every Sunday afternoon while watching football. That chair was his throne. No one else was allowed to sit in it. Now, it was buried under a mountain of glossy shopping bags. Nordstrom, Macy's, Best Buy. The bags were overflowing with shoeboxes and designer clothes. Karen and Charles hadn't just wasted time. They had started spending the insurance money before the ink on the death certificate was even dry. I turned away, unable to look at it anymore, and headed straight for the back of the house. I needed to breathe. I needed to be somewhere that still felt like him. I headed for the garage. Dad didn't call it a garage, he called it the workshop. To everyone else, it was just a place to park a car. But to Thomas Guthrie, it was a sanctuary. It was his man cave, but not the kind with a bar and a pool table. It was a cathedral of labor. This was where he built the cabinets for the local orphanage. This was where he taught me how to sand wood until it felt like silk. It was always pristine. I opened the door, expecting the smell of sawdust. Instead, I smelled stale corn chips and energy drinks. I stood in the doorway, my grip tightening on the strap of my bag until my knuckles turned white. The sanctuary had been desecrated. The floor, usually swept clean enough to eat off of, was littered with crushed cans of Mountain Dew and empty fast food wrappers. Grease stains were smeared across the concrete, and in the center of the room, sitting on Dad's sacred workbench chair, was Charles. My stepbrother was wearing a pair of noise-canceling headphones that probably cost $300. He was staring intently at a massive 60-inch flat-screen television that had been mounted directly onto the pegboard wall, right over where Dad used to hang his handsaws. On the screen, a chaotic gunfight was blazing. Charles was playing Call of Duty. "Get him! Shoot him in the head! I'm a sniper, baby!" Charles screamed at the screen, his voice cracking. "You can't touch me." The irony hit me so hard it almost made me laugh. Here was a 22-year-old boy who had never done a push-up in his life, who complained if the air conditioning was too cold, pretending to be a warrior in the very room where a real man had spent a lifetime building a legacy. I stood there, a real sergeant in the United States Army, watching a cosplayer desecrate my father's memory. But then I saw his feet. Charles was wearing a brand new pair of Air Jordan sneakers, the soles pristine and white, and he had them propped up on the workbench. Underneath his expensive heels lay a stack of wide blue paper, blueprints. They were the architectural drawings for the community center Dad had been designing for free before he died. He had spent months on those drafts, agonizing over every angle, every beam. Now, they were being used as a footrest and a placemat for a bag of Cheetos. Something snapped inside me. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet, terrifying click of a safety being disengaged. I walked across the garage, my boots silent on the oil-stained concrete. I didn't say a word. I reached out and ripped the headphones off Charles's head. "Hey!" Charles yelped, jumping in his seat. He spun around, eyes wide, fumbling with the controller. When he saw it was me, the fear in his eyes instantly dissolved into a sneer of arrogance. "What the hell is your problem?" He spat, grabbing a handful of Cheetos and stuffing them into his mouth. Orange dust rained down onto the blueprints. "Oh, the fake sister is home. Great." He leaned back, interlacing his fingers behind his head, looking at me with half-lidded, disrespectful eyes. "Mom said you were coming to sign the papers to renounce the inheritance," he said, chewing loudly. "Make it quick, all right? I'm in the middle of a ranked match. I don't have time for your drama." I looked down at the blueprints. There was a grease stain spreading across the drafting paper where a Cheeto had fallen. It was a small thing, a meaningless piece of paper to him. But to me, it was the final insult. It was the evidence that they didn't just want his money. They wanted to erase the dignity of his labor. I looked at Charles. I could have broken his nose. It would have been easy. I knew 6 different ways to incapacitate him before he could even stand up. But Dad didn't raise a thug. He raised a soldier. And soldiers pick their battles. I reached down and slowly pulled the blueprints out from under his feet. Charles laughed, a short barking sound, and turned back to his video game. "Just go away, Lexi," he muttered. "This is my house now." I rolled up the blueprints, brushing the orange dust off with a tenderness that contradicted the rage boiling in my veins. My eyes shifted from the stained paper to the back of his head. "Enjoy the game, Charles," I said, my voice low and cold, cutting through the noise of the simulated gunfire on the screen. "Enjoy it while you can, because your playtime is about to be over." I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't go to my old bedroom. I walked straight out the front door, got into my rental car, and drove. I wasn't going to cry. I was going to see a lawyer. I slipped out of the house around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I told Karen I needed to drive to the gas station to buy a pack of cigarettes, even though I hadn't smoked since basic training. She didn't even look up from her catalog of expensive urns. She just waved a hand dismissively, probably relieved to have me out of her sight so she could continue calculating how to spend my father's life savings. I walked out to the driveway and climbed into the cab of Dad's Ford F-150. It was an older model, a beat-up workhorse with a dent in the rear bumper where he had backed into a cement mixer 10 years ago. As I turned the key, the V8 engine roared to life with a familiar, throaty rumble that vibrated through the seat. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, gripping the worn leather where his hands had been just days ago. For a moment, it felt like he was sitting right there in the passenger seat, smelling of sawdust and peppermint gum. I didn't go to the gas station. I drove to the edge of town, pulling into a small gravel lot behind a barber shop. There, tucked away from the main street, was a small office with a weathered oak sign. Whitaker and Associates, attorneys at law. Mr. Whitaker was 65 years old, a former Marine with a haircut that was still high and tight and a handshake that could crush a walnut. He was waiting for me. "Enter, Sergeant," he boomed as I opened the door. The office looked like a time capsule. It smelled of old legal paper, gun oil, and quality alcohol. On the wall behind his desk hung a black and white POW MIA flag, and mounted right above it was an antique double-barreled shotgun. It was a room that commanded respect. Whitaker motioned for me to sit and slid a crystal glass across the heavy mahogany desk. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from a decanter. "Kentucky bourbon," he said. "Your dad's favorite. Drink up. You're going to need it." I took a sip. The alcohol burned pleasantly on its way down, settling my nerves. "Karen said she fired you," I said. "She tried," Whitaker grunted. "But your father gave me strict instructions. If Karen called to report his death, I was to sit tight and wait for you to walk through that door. He knew you would come." He leaned forward, his expression softening. "Lexi, about a month ago, Tom came to see me. He looked terrible, and it wasn't just his heart condition. It was a sickness of the soul. He had discovered that Karen had siphoned $50,000 out of the construction company's operating account. She used it to buy that sports car for Charles." My jaw tightened. $50,000. That was the payroll money. "That wasn't the worst of it," Whitaker continued, his voice dropping an octave. "The money was just theft. The emotional betrayal was what killed him. He told me he overheard a phone conversation Karen was having with you." I frowned, confused. "Me? I haven't spoken to her in months until she called to tell me he died." "Exactly," Whitaker nodded grimly. "She was faking it, or she was talking to an accomplice. But she made sure Tom heard her side of the call. She told him that you were on the line, laughing at him. She told him that you called him a washed-up hick bricklayer and that you were ashamed of your blue-collar upbringing. She told him you wished he would just hurry up and die so you could sell the land." I felt the blood drain from my face. She told him that? And he believed her. He was devastated, Lexi. He sat right in that chair where you are sitting, and he wept. He cried because he thought his little girl hated him. I slammed the glass down on the desk, cracking the coaster. "I will kill her," I whispered. "I will absolutely kill her." Hold your fire, Sergeant, Whitaker said sharply. A small, cold smile touched his lips. Your father was a builder. He knew that before you tear a wall down, you have to check the foundation. He didn't just sit there and cry. He got angry. And then, he got busy. Whitaker stood up and walked over to a black steel safe in the corner of the room. He spun the dial. Left, right, left, and the heavy door swung open with a metallic clank. Tom hired a private investigator the very next day, Whitaker explained, reaching into the safe. He had listening devices installed in the living room and the kitchen. He recorded everything for the last 3 weeks, every conversation between Karen and her boyfriend, every plot she made with Charles. He pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. And he did one more thing, Whitaker said, placing the envelope in front of me. He managed to get a hair sample from Charles's hairbrush and a sample from his own. He sent them to a private lab. He wanted to be absolutely sure that the legacy of the Guthrie name did not fall into the hands of a stranger. He pushed the envelope across the desk. This is his final order, Lexi. I reached out and took the package. It felt heavy. Not heavy in weight, but heavy with the honor of a man who refused to be played for a fool. I broke the seal and tipped the contents into my hand. Out slid a silver USB drive and a stack of legal documents. Tomorrow is the funeral, I said, my voice steady now. She is going to put on a show. Whitaker stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. Then we will turn that chapel into a courtroom. I will be there as the executor of the will. Your mission is to maintain your bearing until an hour. Do not let her provoke you into firing early. We wait until the enemy is fully exposed. I stood up and saluted him. It wasn't a formal military salute, but a gesture of deep respect from one warrior to another. Understood, sir. I took the USB drive and the folded documents and tucked them into the inside pocket of my jacket, directly over my heart. I could feel the hard edges pressing against my ribs. It wasn't just evidence, it was ammunition. And I was fully loaded. I pulled my father's Ford truck into the driveway around 6:30. The house, which had been silent and empty just hours before, was now bursting with noise. Cars lined the street, blocking the mailboxes of neighbors who were undoubtedly peering through their blinds. It was time for the pre-funeral gathering, a tradition as old as the town itself. People called it a repast, or just paying respects, but tonight it felt more like a shark's feeding frenzy. I walked through the front door and was immediately hit by a wall of humidity and noise. The air smelled of fried chicken grease, heavy perfume, and brewing coffee. The living room was packed. Distant relatives I hadn't seen since I was 12 were balancing paper plates on their knees, while business partners of my father stood in tight circles, speaking in hushed tones about contracts and liquidity. On the dining room table, a white lace tablecloth had been spread out. It was groaning under the weight of the potluck spread. There were buckets of KFC original recipe, plastic bowls of potato salad turning yellow at the edges, and a massive glass baking dish of green bean casserole topped with those crispy French fried onions. A sweating pitcher of sweet tea sat in the center, acting as a beacon for the sticky-fingered children running underfoot. And in the center of it all was Karen. She was wearing a black dress that was just a size too tight and a hemline an inch too short for a grieving widow. Her makeup was flawless, her hair sprayed into a helmet of blonde curls. She moved through the room like a politician, accepting hugs, dabbing at dry eyes, and accepting casseroles with a tragic, brave smile. I retreated to the corner of the kitchen, grabbing a cold bottle of beer from the cooler. I leaned against the counter, feeling like a ghost in the home I grew up in. I touched the pocket of my jacket. The USB drive was still there, hard and cold. Hold your fire, Whitaker had said. Wait for the enemy to expose herself. It didn't take long. Poor Tom, Karen's voice rang out, piercing through the low murmur of the crowd. She was standing near the fireplace, holding court with a group of my father's oldest friends and a few elderly aunts. Those last few days were just heartbreaking. He kept staring at the phone, just waiting for Lexi to call. The room went quiet. I stiffened, my grip tightening on the beer bottle. But you know how it is, Karen sighed, looking over at me with an expression of pity that was so thick it was almost suffocating. She is busy with her army career, always chasing that next promotion. Tom understood, really. He knew the military was more important to her than family. She paused for effect, tilting her head. Bless her heart. The phrase hung in the air like a cloud of poison gas. In the South and the Midwest, bless her heart isn't a prayer. It is the polite way of calling someone selfish, stupid, or pathetic. A collective tisk rippled through the group of aunts. One of them, a woman named Martha who hadn't visited my dad once while he was sick, shook her head and looked at me with disdain. Imagine not coming home when your father is dying. Kids these days have no loyalty. I wanted to scream. I wanted to smash the beer bottle against the counter and play the recording of Karen laughing while my father cried. But I swallowed the rage. It tasted bitter, like bile and cheap lager. Karen wasn't done. She reached out and grabbed Charles by the arm, pulling him into the center of the circle. Thank God for Charles, she beamed, resting her head on his shoulder. My sweet boy was there every single day. He sat by Tom's bedside, feeding him soup, reading to him when his eyes got too tired. I almost choked on my drink. Charles? Feeding him soup? Charles had been in Florida on spring break with his girlfriend the entire week Dad was in the ICU. I knew it because I saw his Instagram stories. But the crowd ate it up. They looked at Charles, who was nodding with a humble, somber expression, like he was the second coming of a saint. Tom told me before he passed, Karen said, her voice dropping to a reverent whisper, that Charles is the only one he trusted to take over the company. He said Lexi is too rigid, too damaged by the war to handle the business. Charles is the future. The murmurs of agreement were like physical blows. They were rewriting history in real time, painting the parasite as the hero and the soldier as the villain. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin out, I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes just to have something to do with my hands. Charles sauntered in, rattling a glass full of ice. He walked past me to the freezer, grabbed a handful of ice cubes, and then leaned in close to my shoulder. He smelled of bourbon and arrogance. Hey sis, he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. Mom wanted me to remind you about tomorrow. I didn't look at him. I kept scrubbing a plate. What about it? The funeral, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Don't wear that uniform, that flashy blue suit with all the medals. It's tacky. Mom says you look like you're wearing a Halloween costume. Just wear a black dress like a normal person. We don't want you embarrassing the family. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, a patronizing pat, and walked away, chuckling to himself. I stood there, staring at the soapy water. The water had turned cold and gray. A Halloween costume. That was what they called the uniform I had bled in. That was what they called the symbol of the oath I took. I dried my hands on a towel, slowly, methodically. I walked to the guest room closet where my garment bag was hanging. I unzipped it. The gold buttons of my army dress blues glinted in the dim light. The stripes on the trousers were sharp enough to cut glass. Charles wanted me to wear a dress. He wanted me to be small, feminine, and grieving quietly in the background. I ran my fingers over the medals on the chest. No, I thought, I am not wearing a dress. Tomorrow, I am wearing my armor. And I am bringing the war to you. Back in the present moment, inside St. Mark's Chapel, the air was vibrating with the echo of Karen's whisper. You are just a stray. He never loved you. She pulled back, expecting me to crumble. She expected the daughter she remembered, the quiet girl who used to hide in her room to avoid conflict. But that girl didn't exist anymore. That girl had been forged in fire and tempered by the United States Army. Instead of crying, I stood up straighter. I reached up and adjusted the knot of my tie, my movements slow and deliberate. I looked down at her with a calmness that was terrifyingly absolute. That calmness broke her. Karen's face, usually a mask of composed, southern grace, twisted into something ugly. The veins in her neck bulged against her pearls. She realized her psychological ambush had failed, so she resorted to brute force. Are you deaf? Karen screeched, her voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. I said get out. This is a private funeral for the Thompson family. You carry the name Guthrie, but you don't belong to this house anymore." She turned to Charles, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Get her out of here, Charles. Now." Charles stood up. He looked relieved to finally have something to do other than sit still. He puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing in his expensive suit. He was 6 feet tall, towering over me, but his stance was all wrong. He was soft. He had the sloppy center of gravity of someone whose only physical conflict was fighting with a game controller. He stepped into the aisle, blocking my path to the exit, but I wasn't trying to leave. "Mom said leave, Lexi," he sneered, loud enough for his girlfriend in the third row to hear. "Don't make me drag you out." I didn't move. I just stared at him. Frustrated by my lack of fear, Charles did the stupidest thing he could possibly do. He swung his arm out and shoved me hard in the shoulder. It was a clumsy, heavy-handed push. Caught off guard, I stumbled back 2 steps. My lower back slammed into the solid mahogany of my father's casket. Thud. The sound was sickening. The heavy wooden coffin shifted on its stand. My service cap, the white peaked hat that is part of my dress blues uniform, was knocked from my head. It tumbled through the air and landed upside down on the floor, rolling to a stop at Karen's feet. The entire chapel gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the room. In the second row, I saw 3 elderly men stand up simultaneously. They were Vietnam veterans, friends of my father. Their faces were red with rage, their canes gripped like weapons. They were ready to rush the altar. I held up a white-gloved hand, palm out, "Stand down." They hesitated, but they obeyed. This was my fight. I slowly bent down. I picked up my cover from the floor. I brushed a speck of invisible dust from the brim, taking my time. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. When I finally looked up, I didn't look at Charles as a brother. I didn't look at him as a human being. I looked at him as a target. Threat level 1. "You just made 2 mistakes, Charles," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it projected to the back of the room with crystal clarity. "First, you just assaulted a non-commissioned officer of the United States Army." Charles blinked, his bravado flickering. He took a half step back. "Second," I continued, stepping into his personal space, forcing him to look up at me. "And much more importantly, you just disturbed my father's sleep." Charles looked at me, and for the first time, he saw the violence I was holding back. He saw the soldier who had trained to kill people much scarier than a college dropout in a suit. He looked over his shoulder at his mother, his eyes pleading for help. "Mom," he squeaked. "Get her," Karen shrieked, though she was now clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. "Security. Someone call the police. She's ruining my husband's funeral." "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Thompson." The deep, booming voice didn't come from the altar. It came from the back of the chapel. The heavy double doors at the entrance burst open, banging against the walls. Sunlight flooded into the dim sanctuary, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. 2 figures stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon sun like lawmen in an old Western movie. On the left was Mr. Whitaker, holding his battered leather briefcase. On the right was a man with shoulders as wide as a doorway, wearing a beige uniform and a gold star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Miller. The sheriff walked down the center aisle, his boots thudding heavily on the carpet. His hand rested casually near his service weapon, his eyes locked onto Charles. Whitaker walked beside him, his face as hard as granite. Karen's face drained of all color. She looked like she was about to faint. "You," she stammered. "What are you doing here? I fired you. I told you never to come near us again." Whitaker didn't stop until he reached the front row. He placed his briefcase on the communion table and looked at Karen with cold disdain. "You fired me, Karen," Whitaker said calmly. "But Tom didn't." I walked past a trembling Charles and stepped up to the podium. I grabbed the microphone and pulled it from its stand. A sharp squeal of feedback pierced the air, causing everyone to cover their ears. Screech! The noise cut through the tension like a knife. I looked out at the sea of faces, the neighbors, the friends, the strangers. If you believe that justice should always be served, no matter how long it takes, hit that like button right now and comment, "I stand with Lexi," below. Let's show them that they can't silence the truth. I reached into my jacket pocket, right over my heart. I pulled out the silver USB drive and held it up high, letting it catch the light. "You thought this was over, Karen," I said into the microphone. "You thought you could bury the truth along with my father. But you forgot one thing. My father was a Marine. He prepared for every contingency." I turned to the lawyer. "Mr. Whitaker," I commanded, my voice steady and unbreakable, "activate Protocol Alpha." Mr. Whitaker placed his laptop on the polished wood of the communion table. He didn't rush. He moved with the methodical precision of a man who had cleaned rifles under fire. He pulled a black audio cable from his briefcase and plugged it into the headphone jack, connecting the computer directly to the chapel's public address system. A sharp electronic ping echoed through the room, signaling the connection was live. That sound snapped Karen out of her shock. She realized with terrifying clarity that her control was slipping away. "No," she screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "You cannot play that. That is privileged information. I am his wife." She lunged forward, her hands clawing at the air, aiming for the laptop. She moved faster than I expected, fueled by panic and adrenaline. But she didn't get far. Sheriff Miller took one heavy step to the side, placing his massive frame directly between Karen and the lawyer. He didn't draw his weapon, but he rested his hand casually, yet firmly, on his gun belt. It was a universal signal of authority in every small town in America. "Sit down, Mrs. Thompson," Miller said. His voice was low, rumbling like a diesel engine, leaving no room for argument. "Let Tom say his final words." Karen froze. She looked at the sheriff, then at the rows of staring faces behind her. She was trapped. Trembling, she backed away, collapsing onto the front pew. Her hands gripped the velvet cushion so hard I could hear the fabric tearing under her manicured nails. The chapel fell into a silence so deep it felt heavy. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Whitaker hit the spacebar. For a moment, there was only the sound of static hiss through the speakers. Then, a rhythmic, mechanical whoosh click filled the room. It was the sound of an oxygen machine. And then, my father spoke. "To my daughter, Lexi." The voice was weak, raspy, and breathless. It was the sound of a man whose lungs were failing him, a ghost speaking from the grave. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I bit my lips so hard I tasted copper. "Today is March 15th, Dad's voice continued, each word a struggle. "If you are hearing this tape, I have already gone to meet the Lord. I am sorry, Lexi. I am so sorry. Your father, he is a coward." A sob broke from his throat on the recording, a raw, jagged sound of pure misery. Tears instantly blurred my vision. To hear my father, the strongest man I ever knew, call himself a coward was like a physical blow. "Karen told me you wouldn't come," he wheezed. "She said you were ashamed of me. She said you called me a washed-up hick bricklayer." I believed her, Lexi. I believed her because I was scared. I was scared of dying alone in this big house. In the recording, there was a shift. The sound of a door opening in the background. Dad must have hidden the recorder under his blankets. "Listen," Dad whispered urgently on the tape. "She is in the kitchen. Listen to this." Through the static, a new voice drifted in. It was distant, but unmistakable. It was Karen. And she wasn't crying. She was laughing. The sound of a cork popping from a wine bottle was crisp and clear. "Oh, stop worrying, Ray." Karen's voice floated through the speakers, light and flirtatious. She was talking to someone on the phone. "The old man is kicking the bucket any day now. Dr. Evans said his heart is functioning at 10%. Just a little more stress, and pop." She laughed again, the sound echoing chillingly in the silent chapel. "And don't worry about the brat," she continued. "I blocked her number on his phone. She thinks he's fine. By the time she finds out, he will be ash in a jar and the money will be in my account." The reaction in the chapel was visceral. People gasped in horror. Mrs. Ruth covered her mouth with both hands. The veterans in the second row were gripping the pews in white-knuckled fury. On the recording, the background noise faded as the door closed. Dad's breathing was heavy, labored. "She threatened me, Lexi," Dad said, his voice gaining a sudden, steel-like edge. "She made me sign the transfer papers for the company last week. She told me if I didn't sign them, she would put me in a state-run nursing home. The cheap one down on County Road 9. She said she would leave me there to rot in my own filth." A murmur of outrage swept through the room. Threatening a dying man with a nursing home was the lowest form of cruelty. "But she forgot who I am," Dad whispered. The weakness was gone from his voice now, replaced by the grit of a man who had survived the jungles of Vietnam. "I signed her papers, but I am a Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. We adapt. We overcome. I may be old, but I am not stupid." The sound of a heavy metal dial spinning clicked through the speakers, the sound of his safe opening. "I wrote a new will last night," he said. "And I did one more thing. Something I should have done 22 years ago when I married her." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was deafening. For 10 seconds, no one moved. The truth hung in the air, naked and ugly. Then Karen shot up from her seat. Her face was wild, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "Fake!" she screamed, her voice shredding the silence. "That is a fake. This is AI. It's artificial intelligence. You can do anything with computers now. She made that up to frame me. My husband loved me. He loved Charles." She pointed a shaking finger at me, desperate to find an angle, any angle, to save herself. "You think you can fool these people with a deepfake recording? Everyone knows technology can fake a voice." She looked around for support, but she found none. The faces staring back at her were filled with disgust. I stepped back up to the microphone. My face was dry. I wasn't crying anymore. The sadness was gone, replaced by the cold, hard certainty of justice. "You want to talk about fake, Karen?" I asked, my voice echoing off the walls. "You want to talk about technology? Fine, let's talk about biology." I nodded to Mr. Whitaker. "Open the second envelope." Mr. Whitaker reached into the second envelope, his movements calm and precise. The sound of the thick paper sliding out seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent chapel. He unfolded the document, smoothing it flat on the communion table. It bore the red, official seal of GeneTech Laboratories. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He put them on slowly, letting the suspense build until the air in the room felt thin and electric. He looked over the rim of his glasses at Karen, then down at the paper. "This is a certified DNA paternity test," Whitaker announced, his voice projecting to the back of the room without the need for a microphone. "It was authorized by Thomas Guthrie himself 2 weeks ago." He cleared his throat. "Sample 1. Thomas Guthrie and Lexi Guthrie. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. He looked up. "Conclusion? Lexi Guthrie is the biological daughter of Thomas Guthrie." A wave of relief washed over me so powerful it almost knocked me to my knees. For 6 years, I had let her poison seep into my mind. I had let her make me doubt my own blood. But science didn't lie. From the second row, a few of the old veterans started to clap, a slow, rhythmic applause of validation. Whitaker held up a hand. "I am not finished." The clapping died down instantly. Whitaker turned his gaze to Charles, who was still standing near the altar, looking pale and confused. "Sample 2. Whitaker read, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. "Thomas Guthrie and Charles Thompson. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. He paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. "Conclusion. Thomas Guthrie is excluded as the biological father." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a world, shattering. Charles looked like he had been physically struck. He staggered back, his legs hitting the edge of the pew. He turned to his mother, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and betrayal. "Mom," Charles whispered, his voice trembling. "Mom, you told me he was my dad. You told me my biological father died in a car crash before I was born." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She was stammering, her face flushing a deep, ugly shade of crimson. Charles, listen to me. It was complicated. I did what I had to do. You lied, Charles said, his voice rising. You told me I was the heir. You told me I was the only one who mattered. The truth was naked for everyone to see. Charles wasn't the golden child. He was just another pawn in Karen's long con. She had tricked my father into marriage, likely claiming she was pregnant with his child, or using Charles to guilt him into support. She had erased a stranger's existence to secure a paycheck. I looked at Charles. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. All that was left was a 22-year-old boy realizing his entire identity was a fabrication. She played you, Charles, I said softly, just like she played him. And now for the final matter, Whitaker interrupted, drawing the attention back to the podium. He pulled out the final document, the last will and testament. This will was drafted and notarized on March 11th, Whitaker stated. It supersedes all previous documents. In this document, Mr. Guthrie explicitly cites constructive fraud, undue influence, and mental duress as the reasons for the following changes. He looked directly at Karen. To my wife, Karen Thompson, and her son Charles Thompson, I leave nothing. You are hereby disinherited with cause, effectively immediately. Karen let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. All assets, Whitaker continued, reading the final clause, including the family estate, all liquid savings, and 100% ownership of Guthrie Construction, are transferred to my sole beneficiary and daughter, Sergeant Lexi Guthrie. No! The scream ripped out of Karen's throat, raw and animalistic. The facade of the grieving widow vanished completely. In its place was a woman who had just seen her retirement plan evaporate. That money is mine, she shrieked, her face contorted into a mask of pure greed. I earned it. I lived in that house. I cleaned up his mess. I wiped his ass when he was too weak to move. You can't take it from me. Blind with rage, she launched herself at Mr. Whitaker. She moved with terrifying speed, her hands hooked into claws, aiming for the documents on the table as if destroying the paper would change the reality. But she never reached him. A massive hand, rough as sandpaper and thick as a brick, clamped down on her shoulder. It was Pete Garrison, my dad's foreman. He had moved from the second row with surprising speed for a man of his size. He didn't shove her, he simply held her in place with the immovable strength of a man who had laid concrete for 40 years. That's enough, Karen, Pete growled, his voice deep and dangerous. Don't you dare touch good people with those dirty hands. He spun her around, forcing her to look at the crowd that now looked at her with nothing but revulsion. The game is over, Pete said. You lost. Charles, standing a few feet away, looked at his mother struggling in Pete's grip. He looked at the DNA results lying on the table. And for the first time in his life, he made a decision that didn't involve her. He shook his head, a look of pure disgust crossing his face. He reached up, loosened his tie, and threw it on the floor. Then, without a word, he turned his back on his mother and started walking toward the exit, leaving her alone to face the consequences. The silence that followed Charles's departure was short-lived. It was broken by the heavy, rhythmic thud of work boots hitting the hardwood floor. Behind Pete Garrison, who was still holding Karen firmly by the shoulder, movement rippled through the second and third rows of the chapel. It started with one man standing up, an older guy with gray hair and a back brace. Then, another stood. Then, 3 more. Within seconds, a dozen men had risen from their pews. These weren't the men in tailored suits who had been whispering about business deals during the eulogy. These were the men in flannel shirts buttoned to the neck. These were men in stiff denim jeans that were faded at the knees. Some of them still had fine white drywall dust clinging to their boots and calloused hands that looked like they were carved from oak. They were the crew of Guthrie Construction. They were the men my father had hired, trained, and looked after for 30 years. They moved with a silent, unified purpose, stepping into the aisle and forming a solid line behind Pete. They created a human wall, a wall of men, blocking Karen from the rest of the congregation. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a barrier of blue-collar loyalty that no amount of money or manipulation could breach. Pete Garrison looked down at Karen. He released her shoulder, but he didn't step back. He simply pointed one thick, dust-stained finger toward the double doors at the back of the chapel. "You heard the lawyer, Karen," Pete said, his voice rumbling deep in his chest. "You have no authority here anymore. You are trespassing on Guthrie land. Now, you can walk out of here on your own 2 feet, or me and the boys can give you a personal escort. Ideally, we would prefer the second option." Karen looked at the wall of men. She looked at their faces, faces she had likely ignored or looked down upon for years. Now, they were the judges, and the verdict was unanimous. I stepped down from the podium. As I approached the aisle, the wall of men parted for me. They stepped aside with a reverence that brought a lump to my throat, creating a path for me to walk through. I stopped directly in front of Karen. She looked pathetic. The confident, scheming socialite was gone. Her mascara was running in black streaks down her cheeks, ruining her perfect foundation. Her expensive dress was wrinkled from her struggle with Pete. She was trembling, not with grief, but with the terrifying realization that her safety net had been set on fire. I raised my left arm and looked pointedly at my watch, a sturdy tactical field watch that had survived deployments in the desert. "It is currently 2 o'clock, I said, my voice calm and icy. "I am giving you exactly 1 hour." Karen blinked, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What?" "1 hour," I repeated. "You are going to go back to the house. You are going to pack your clothes and your personal toiletries. And then you're going to leave." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice so only she could hear the steel in it. "And Karen, if one single thing is missing from that house, if one piece of silverware, one picture frame, or even a single rusty nail from my father's workshop is gone, Sheriff Miller will have a warrant for your arrest signed before you cross the county line. It will be grand larceny. Do you understand me?" Karen flinched as if I had slapped her. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes darting for a lifeline. Her gaze landed on the open doorway where Charles had just exited. "Charles!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Charles, come back. Don't let them do this to me." To everyone's surprise, Charles stopped. He was lingering in the vestibule, his hand on the doorframe. He turned around slowly. Karen's face lit up with a flicker of desperate hope. "Charles, baby, fight them. Tell them that house belongs to you. We can sue them. We can fix this." Charles looked at his mother. He looked at the woman who had lied to him about his father, who had used him as a prop to secure a paycheck, who had turned him into a joke in front of the entire town. The look on his face wasn't love. It was pure, unadulterated disgust. He reached up to his neck and ripped off the black silk tie he was wearing, a tie she had probably picked out for him to make him look the part of the heir. He balled it up in his fist and threw it onto the floor. "You lied to me my whole life," Charles said, his voice hollow. "You made me think I was special. You made me a laughingstock." "Charles, please," Karen wailed, reaching out a hand. "Don't call me," he said, turning his back on her for the final time. "I'm done playing your game." He pushed the heavy doors open and walked out into the bright sunlight, leaving her completely alone. Karen stood there, isolated in the middle of the aisle. The congregation, emboldened by the truth, began to murmur. Then someone from the back shouted, "Go! Get out of here!" Another voice joined in, "Leave him in peace." The chants grew louder, a chorus of rejection. Karen stumbled backward, clutching her purse to her chest. She looked at the wall of men, at the sheriff who was watching her with crossed arms, and finally, at me. She saw no mercy in my eyes. She spun around on her heels and ran. It wasn't a graceful exit, it was a frantic, stumbling run. Her high heels clattered loudly against the wooden floor, a chaotic rhythm of panic. Click, clack, click, clack. It sounded like the frantic heartbeat of a trapped animal. She burst through the double doors, almost tripping over the threshold, and disappeared into the blinding light outside. The heavy doors swung shut behind her with a final, resonant boom. The sound echoed through the chapel and then faded. The tension that had gripped the room for the last hour evaporated, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence. But it wasn't the awkward silence of before. It was the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield after the guns have finally stopped firing. The air conditioning hummed. A bird chirped outside the stained glass window. I turned my back on the doors. I walked slowly back up the aisle, past the nodding faces of the construction crew, past Mr. Whitaker, who was cleaning his glasses, and stopped in front of the casket. I placed my hand on the star-spangled field of the flag one last time. I could feel the warmth of the wood beneath the fabric. I closed my eyes and whispered the only words that mattered. Mission accomplished, Dad. You can rest easy now. It has been 3 weeks since the doors of St. Mark's Chapel slammed shut behind Karen, and the silence that has settled over the house at 42 Maple Drive is no longer heavy or oppressive. It is the clean, crisp silence of a fresh start. I stood in the center of the living room, taking a deep breath. For the first time in 6 years, the air didn't catch in my throat. Immediately after the funeral, I hired a professional industrial cleaning crew. I told them to scrub every inch of the place. I wanted every trace of Karen, her cloying floral perfume, the stale reek of her menthol cigarettes, the bad energy she brought into these walls, eradicated. Now, the house smelled of lemon pledge, pine sol, and hard work. I walked over to the bay window and threw the sash open. The cool, damp air of an Ohio spring morning rushed in, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new grass. The for sale sign that had been stabbed into the front lawn was gone, pulled out by my own hands and tossed into the dumpster. I wasn't selling. This house was built on Thomas Guthrie's sweat and blood. It was his castle, and now it was my forward operating base. I picked up my coffee mug and headed toward the back of the house. There was one final room that needed my personal attention. I stepped into the workshop. The transformation was complete. The mountain of trash Charles had left behind, the sticky soda cans, the fast food wrappers, the orange dust of his snacks, had been bagged and banished. The 60-inch television was gone, the holes in the pegboard patched and painted. It looked like a sanctuary again. I ran my hand along the workbench. The wood was stained dark with oil and age, smooth as glass. I had spent the last 2 days reorganizing Dad's tools. Every socket wrench, every screwdriver, every drill bit was back in its designated spot, arranged by size and utility, just the way he liked it. It was a form of meditation, a way to have a conversation with him without saying a word. I knelt down to the bottom cabinet to retrieve a box of galvanized nails for a project I was starting. I pulled the drawer open, but it stuck slightly. I jiggled it, reached my hand into the dark recess at the back to see what was jamming the track, and my fingers brushed against something papery. It wasn't a jam. It was an envelope, taped securely to the underside of the drawer above. My heart skipped a beat. It was the oldest trick in the book, a classic Thomas Guthrie hiding spot. He used to hide birthday cash for me like this when I was a kid, turning a gift into a treasure hunt. I peeled the tape away carefully and pulled the small white envelope into the light. On the front, in his shaky block-letter handwriting, were the words, "For Lexi, to be opened when the guns are silent." I sat down right there on the concrete floor, ignoring the cold seeping through my jeans. My hands, which could assemble an M4 carbine in the dark without shaking, were trembling as I tore the flap open. Inside was a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper. "To my dearest daughter, my bravest soldier," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means the war is over. It means you stood your ground, you held the line, and you reclaimed our home. I never had a doubt, Lexi, not for 1 second." I swallowed hard, a lump forming in my throat the size of a golf ball. "I am sorry I could not stand beside you in that final battle. I am sorry I was too weak to protect you from her lies while I was alive. I was a coward in my old age, Lexi. I let loneliness cloud my judgment. But you have always been the steel in my spine." A tear splashed onto the yellow paper, blurring the word, steel. "I know what she told you. I know she tried to make you feel like an outsider because we don't share the same DNA. But let me tell you something about biology, kiddo. Biology makes relatives. It is loyalty, love, and honor that make a family." I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve, chalking back a sob. "Look at your hands, Lexi. Those hands know how to hold a rifle to protect a nation. but they also know how to hold a hammer to build a home. You are a builder, just like me. That is my legacy. It isn't the money. It isn't the trucks. It's the work. It's the honor of building something that lasts. So dry your eyes, Sergeant. You have a company to run. Make me proud. Semper Fi, my daughter. Love, Dad. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, letting the words sink into my marrow. Semper Fi, always faithful. It was the Marine Corps motto, but for us, it was a promise. I wasn't the adopted kid anymore. I wasn't the outsider. I was his daughter. Slowly, I stood up. I took the letter and pinned it to the corkboard above the workbench, right next to his old, battered hard hat and the folded American flag. Then, I turned to the table. Lying there was a fresh piece of oak I had been carving earlier. Next to it was a pot of gold paint and a brush. I picked up the hammer. It felt heavy, balanced, and familiar in my grip. I walked out the side door of the garage to the driveway entrance where the old company sign hung. It read, Guthrie Construction. I took a deep breath of the morning air. The sun was cresting over the horizon now, painting the Ohio sky in shades of purple and gold. It was a new day. I climbed the ladder and removed the old board. In its place, I hung the new one I'd finished just last night. I drove the nails in with strong, sure strokes. Bang, bang, bang. The sound echoed through the neighborhood like a drumbeat of victory. I stepped back to admire the work. The fresh gold paint glinted in the sunrise. Guthrie and Daughter Construction, Est, 1990, Reborn, 2025. I smiled, resting the hammer against my leg. Karen was gone, the lies were buried. My name was Lexi Guthrie, and I had work to do. Looking back, the most painful lesson I learned wasn't about legal battles or DNA tests. It was realizing that sharing blood doesn't give someone a free pass to disrespect you. Too many of us are taught to keep the peace at the expense of our own mental health. But my father's final command taught me that true peace requires strong boundaries. You do not owe your loyalty to people who treat you like an option or an ATM. Real family isn't determined by a birth certificate. It is determined by who stands beside you when the storm hits. Never be afraid to prune your family tree if the roots are rotten. Your dignity is always worth fighting for. I know my story was intense, but I have a feeling I am not the only one who has had to face a Karen or a Charles in life. Have you ever had to stand your ground against a toxic family member to protect your legacy or your peace of mind? I want to hear your stories in the comments below. Let's create a safe space to support each other. If you enjoyed seeing justice served today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more stories of resilience and truth. Thank you for listening, and remember, in the construction of your life, you are the architect. Build it strong.